thank you all very much for coming. It's great to see everybody here. I really have to take these off. The topic tonight is to talk about the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity, which goes by various names in the sort of casual parlance: the Voter Fraud Commission, the PK Commission, but it is definitely in the news, and I know a lot of you have probably read about it and read about some of the consequences of it. So joining me in this conversation is Amber McReynolds, who's the Director of Elections for the City and County of Denver and Election Administrator Extraordinaire. She is known, yes. She is a superstar in the elections administration world. Everybody knows about Amber, and she does everything she possibly can to help promote access to voting for everybody in Denver. And we're really grateful and really lucky to have her with all of her creativity and drive to make it easy for people to vote. And Denise Maez from the ACLU. She's the policy director at the ACLU here in Colorado, and Denise has been an forever advocate on behalf of all sorts of communities that are frequently marginalized in their right to vote and in other areas. She has been an ally with Common Cause over the years on a number of issues involving the rights of people to stay registered, to not be targeted, and she's frequently at the Capitol lobbying on things that are of importance to us all. So I am delighted. She is also a person extraordinaire.
I didn't bring as good a swag.
No glasses. So anyway, thank you for being here. So I'm going to start with just a little background information about the commission, and then Amber can talk about how we actually run elections and whether there is vulnerability, and what we do in Colorado to try and be sure that the awful things that the commission is imagining aren't in fact happening. And Denise is going to talk about what some of the consequences of the supposed activities of the commission. We don't know exactly what they're going to do, but some of their matching approaches and things like that might be to voters. So for those that don't have as much background, the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity, which is its formal name, was created by executive order from President Trump, and it is chaired by two people, Vice President Pence and Chris Kobach, who is the Kansas Secretary of State. He is a notorious person in the elections world as someone who has frequently run into the buzzsaw of the ACLU. Thank goodness. Thank you, ACLU. The ACLU is his worst enemy, I think is the way it's phrased.
We wore that with a badge of honor.
Yeah. He has undertaken any number of attempts in the state of Kansas to suppress the vote. But he and Mike Pence, Vice President Pence, are the chairs of the commission. There are 10, I think, others on the commission, some of whom have been what in our world we would call voter suppression advocates. Some are Republicans, some are Democrats. And the mission of the commission is less than 100% clear. It really grew out of the statements that were made by President Trump that there were 3 to 5 million illegal votes in the last election, and that really he won the popular vote. That's basically its origin and what exactly they're going to do. They are charged with making a report in 2018 on their findings. They've had exactly one meeting so far, which I don't think was a substantive meeting so much as an organizational kind of meeting and a little bit of a photo op. The one thing that they have done, which has sort of prompted a lot of the publicity, is they sent a letter to every state, to the chief elections officer in every state. In Colorado, that went to Secretary Williams, who's the Secretary of State, asking each state to produce information, to produce a copy, essentially, of their voter file. And the list of data that they wanted was this long. And every state has had to sort of step back and decide what they were going to do. Wow. Whoa. I mean, neither. It's my magic touch. And decide what they were going to do in response to that request. The state responses have been varied across the 50 states. A lot of the response has been dictated by what the law of the particular state allows in terms of disclosure of the voting file. It's in Colorado. We have Colorado Open Records Act. Every state has a different law about what records, government records, are available or not available. They vary from you can't have it at all to you can have anything you want. I think Colorado, honestly, is about in the middle in terms of what's available. I think what has been interesting is the law has allowed for a long time for the voter file to be available for someone to request and get a copy of. Very few voters have known that. So I think this has been a little bit of an education to them about how that works. And so in Colorado, what's happened is the Secretary of State has just Tuesday, I guess. He was supposed to send it Monday, but they had a little bit of a operator error. Didn't quite get it sent. So they sent it on Tuesday morning, a copy of the voter file. So the important question is what information went? And the information, and it's been reported differently in all sorts of different places, but I think the bottom line is the information that got sent was every voter, every registered voter, their name, full name, their addresses, mailing address and residential address, if they had more than one address, the year of their birth, not day or month, right, but just the year of their birth, their party affiliation, when did they register, the date that or date of affiliation, I guess. If they have provided to the secretary a phone number, which not very many people have, honestly, in the voter file, but if they have provided, which is an optional thing to provide a phone number, if they provided that, their phone number was sent, their gender, and I think that's it. Oh, their voting history. Not who you voted for. They don't know. Nobody knows who you voted for except you and anybody that you told. But if you voted is what it is. So, and that goes back as far as I think they asked for it from 2006 forward from the commission. I heard from somebody in the secretary's office on Tuesday that they'd given it back to 2000. So voting history, just if you voted, not anything more detailed than that. So they did not send social security numbers, whole numbers or partial numbers. They did not send driver's license numbers. They did not send your email address. So like no spam from the U.S. government. So the really sort of critical pieces that really personally identify you, not that your name and address don't, but the really critical kinds of pieces of data that we all worry about getting out there, in addition to our credit card number, was not sent. The secretary, that is what's required under Colorado law, and the secretary complied with that. Some states have restrictions on who can ask and how the information can be used. Colorado is pretty broad in who can ask, and it turns out that actually in the last year in 2016, and now remember that was an presidential election year, we all know that, and a year when a lot of political candidates might have wanted to know who was on the voter file, who was registered to vote, where they lived, how to reach them, what their affiliation was, that kind of thing. So it was a year with probably a lot of requests, potentially, for the voter file. They had 126. So in 2016, the same data, I mean, minus people who have, registered recently or died and been taken off the file or something or moved, that same information went to a random assortment of people. Everybody from political candidates, political parties, to real estate developer in New York who wanted a copy of the file. Why? Oh, he's just interested in Colorado, apparently, according to a news report I read today. This is not the first time that the information has ever been shared. It's been shared lots of times, and there are people who get it and put it online. So it may be online, the same information that's available to the commission. So I think in all fairness to the Secretary of State, he did what he was obligated to do under Colorado law in making the voter file available. So that's okay. The real question is what's going to happen next with this information. Everybody is sending from the various states into Washington. And what's going to happen? We don't know for sure, but it's likely that they're going to compare lists. And Denise will talk a little bit about the problems and pitfalls that come out of comparing lists. Chris Kobach, who is, as I said, one of the co-chairs, has a program that he's developed in Kansas called Interstate Crosscheck, which is it's a program that compares voter lists between states. May or may not do it as well as it should be done. But the idea would be, the suspicion is, the lists are going to all be compared, and there's going to be produced a list of people who are registered in more than one state, or who have the same name, and did they vote more than once, and things like that. So that's kind of what we think might be coming out of it. So Amber can speak about a little bit more about what the reaction among voters has been. So you probably have read that a lot of people in Colorado, I think because we responded relatively quickly to the request for information, it triggered responses pretty quickly among the voters. We've had about 5,000, maybe a little bit more, 5,000 people who have withdrawn their registration, who took their name off the voter list, thinking that would mean that then their information wouldn't be sent. Well, it wouldn't. That's true. Their information wouldn't be sent if they weren't on the voter file when it was pulled on Monday of this week. But it also means that they're not going to get a mail ballot, and they're going to have to re-register if they want to vote and participate in our democracy. And the only way that the world's going to continue to get better is if we all participate in our democracy. So, and it sort of feeds the idea that not everybody should participate, not everybody should register. So, but a lot of people have done that. And there's another 250 statewide, as I understand it, who have chosen to become confidential voters, which requires that you sign a statement under penalty of perjury that you are in risk of bodily harm if your information is disclosed. That's a fairly high standard, pretty high requirement, not something that I think people should undertake to say without some careful thought about its veracity. And you're signing a statement and affirming that under penalty of perjury. So, but people have decided that that's another way to go. Mm-hmm. So they would stay on the list, still be on sort of the active voter list, would still get elections communications, would still get mail ballots, but their name would not be disclosed as part of the information that went to the commission. So I guess one of the questions that we need to think about, and I'm going to turn it over to Amber, is what really is there really a problem here? What is it likely the commission, I mean, they say they're looking for fraud, they say they're concerned about election integrity, which we think is more of a witch hunt to look for fraud. But, you know, one of the things Secretary Williams said in his transmittal of the information was, we think we run great elections in Colorado. We don't think we have a significant issue in any way with voter fraud. And so Amber, as one of our best elections administrators in the state, can, I think, speak to how it is we are sure that things we put into place and the way we run our elections to make it not very likely that we're going to have any level of fraud similar to what's being sort of claimed. So I'm going to turn it over. I want to give you this. Turn it over to Amber to speak further about how all that works in Colorado.
Okay, so thank you for having me here. I'm really happy to be here to share what we've been focused on in Denver in this particular area, but really to give an overview of the election process and why sort of one siloed piece of the process doesn't necessarily work on its own. So I'll just kind of explain, like from Denver's perspective, our approach to elections is based on an acronym that I like to call FASTER. We want to run faster elections. And what that stands for is fair, accurate, and accessible, secure, transparent, efficient, and reliable. So all those values together is the appropriate approach to an election process, right? So one thing that we've always been focused on in Denver, and honestly our main focus has been, what is the voter's experience and what do we want that to look like? And how do we build all of the appropriate customer service functions, the operational functions, and how do we staff the election to make sure that that voter's experience and your experience as a voter in Denver meets all of those values that I just talked about. So one thing that we advocated for, and Elizabeth was involved in this, and Elena, who's here, and various other organizations, and I was fortunate to be brought in as the election administrator involved. Back in 2013, we sort of did a large election reform in Colorado that included modernization of voter registration processes, including getting rid of the precinct residency requirement. We used to have a 30-day precinct residency requirement. You had to be in your specific precinct to be eligible to vote in that election. And I'm pretty sure that if you've ever moved, you haven't called the election office to say, when is the next election so that I can go and schedule my moving van after that, right? So we wanted to modernize that and make it fair for voters to participate in the election that they wanted where they lived. So we did that piece, and then we also added ballot delivery. And it isn't, I don't like to call it vote by mail. It's not the Oregon model. It's not the Washington model. It's ballot delivery. So prior to every election, if you're an active voter and we know where you are, you will get a ballot delivered to you for every type of election. So it's consistent. So you're going to get that every time. And we added that in primarily because our voters, and we looked at the data, voters were asking for that. They were opting in, asking for mail ballots over and over and over in every election. And that was our number one call in the 2012 presidential, which was, you sent me a ballot in the primary because that was maybe an all-mail ballot election. Why didn't you send me one for the general? Well, it was because they weren't on the permanent list, right? So in looking at all of that customer-driven data, we advocated for modernizing the election process, registration issues, all the way through to ballot delivery. And voters have responded very positively to this. And I can tell you in the 2016 election, one of the things that we saw, usually we see people that had issues with getting to the right polling place or finding their right location or registering on time. And we got thank you notes inside of mail ballot envelopes of, I moved from such and such state, and I won't call out any state in there, but I moved from such and such state and I voted and this was my first election and I can't tell you how easy and efficient it was for me. And that, as an election administrator and the folks in our office, when we get that kind of feedback, we know that we've done the right things, right? So focusing on the customer, putting the customer first as the voters, or maybe the customers or candidates, has been extremely positive. And we've made a difference, and we've made it fair, and we've made it accessible. And as part of that reform, we've also added security into the process. And a couple ways that we've done that. So in Colorado now, prior to that reform, we did not consume data from the National Change of Address database at the post office. So when you fill out a change of address there at the post office, we didn't get that information from the post office prior to 2013. We now get that. As part of this reform, we automatically get that. So if you fill out a change of address, whether it's online or on a postcard, that comes to us. And we update your record automatically. And even if you go to another county, if you go to Arapahoe County from Denver, Arapahoe County automatically pulls your record into Arapahoe County now based on that change of address record and sends you a ballot. So you move 2 weeks later, maybe there's an election, you're going to get a ballot sent to you by your new county, right? So we're empowering you as a voter to get your ballot, get your information updated, and you haven't had to fill out a piece of paper to do it, another one. So it's making all these systems work together, and our roles have never been more accurate. So the voter registration files, where people are in Colorado, has never been more accurate. By sending you a ballot, we have to know where you are. So you're also, as a voter, if you're not filling out a change of address at the post office or you haven't updated your information, you're going to need to do that to get your ballot sent to you. Otherwise, you're going to have to come to a vote center or you're going to have to contact us. Most states don't have that. Kansas, you don't get a mail ballot mailed to you. You don't get your address updated through the post office. So you as a voter, if you're going to have to go in and maybe your address is correct, maybe it isn't. But in Colorado, we're checking that constantly, whether it's national change of address, we're an ERIC state. ERIC is the information sharing network of states that run that themselves, and they cross-check data. But the other part of ERIC that is happening is we're also identifying voters that are not registered, and we're proactively reaching out to them and saying, here's your options to get registered to vote. So it's a comprehensive solution. We're not looking to take people off. We are looking to figure out if you've moved, to either put you in the right county or do an outreach to tell you to register in another state. But we're also looking to see if we can proactively get you registered prior to the election. And why? Because that cuts down your wait time, makes it easier for us administratively. It makes the roles more accurate, and it gives you a more accessible voting experience, right? So we have to consider all the values in the election process. So fairness, accessibility, security, transparency, efficiency, and reliability. And that's where we really want to build all those systems to do that thing. And in Colorado, and I think, and I might be biased, but I've traveled and I've spoken to many places, Colorado, I think, has the best process right now. And that includes modern registration deadlines, a modern online registration system, updating addresses proactively, sending you a ballot to your house, wherever you may be, giving you an in-person voting experience at vote centers if you want that, and giving you all the options so you as a voter are empowered to decide how you want to vote. You can update your information easily, and we then have a more secure system in place that's transparent and accessible. So that's really where we come at this from. And, we've, I think, done this really well, not only in Denver, but I think the state as a whole has done it well. One of the concerns we continue to have with the work of the commission, and Elizabeth touched on this, is there are no clear objectives. And the data that was provided to them that's publicly available isn't going to, if their objective is to match and determine if people are voting in multiple states, you can't data match using publicly available data. So year of birth and name That's going to give you, in the Kansas cross-check system, they have a 99% error rate because those are the only fields they're using. We need to know Social Security number, driver's license number. And the ERIC system that Colorado is a part of is the election directors at the state level are the ones that are on the board managing that. It's a secure environment. You opt in as a state. They do this cross-check, and then they give the state back their data, and the state then decides, okay, what do we do with this? Do we do an outreach to the voters? Do we update based on this information? How do we handle it? So the states are empowered to work collectively and take that information from that group of governing body, which includes the states, because states, by the way, are responsible for running their elections, which is a big deal, right? Where the states are, that is a state's right to do. So, you know, I'm a big advocate of ERIC. Colorado's done really well. They were one of the first states to be part of ERIC. And one of the things that's disappointing, at least from looking at the makeup of the commission, is there aren't ERIC states on the commission. So ERIC states are not represented there. And then there's a lot of folks that are data scientists that have been doing this for years and years and years. MIT has a fantastic professor that has looked at this type of data for years. And that's the kind of expertise that you'd want to see on a commission or on a structure looking at this, because they've done it for years. They've been looking at it very closely, and it is a science. It's an art and it's a science to do this correctly so that people can still have access to the process. It's a secure system. It's transparent and efficient and reliable, right? So with that, I'll turn it over to Denise. I'm happy to take questions as we go forward. So thank you.
Thanks, Amber.
I'm going to start by saying that every time I deal with a new policy initiative of this administration, I seem to need to pour a glass of wine. I really think, first of all, thank you for being here, because it's so important that all of you are part of this dialogue. And I want to thank Common Cause for really keeping the notion of election integrity, like the real notion of that, really in its place. And they certainly did the heavy lifting on the Modernization Act. The County Clerks Association with folks like Amber did as well. And that's really, I think, the way to bring democracy. If there was any criticism about the Wayne Williams being so willing to turn over the information to this commission, our criticism was simply that we believe that he missed an opportunity to talk more about how we need to widen the franchise of voting rights and not look for opportunities to intimidate people or keep them away from the ballot box, which is precisely what we think this commission is all about. Now, I think Amber touched on the one key point of how inaccurate or how sloppy, quite frankly, these sorts of databases can be. Kobach was the original author of the interstate voter registration cross-check. I wrote it down, though I know the exact name, but that's what it is. And it's the one that Amber refers to that has pretty much like a high rate of inaccuracies. And here's the deal, right, is that, number one, it has a disproportionate impact on communities of color. You know, if you're named Jose Garcia, you're going to be registered in a lot of states. That name, not that person. That's the problem. And Crosscheck has the same problem, and there's nothing in this, new way that we presume they're going to do is take all of the state voter registration information, compare names, hopefully maybe parts of date of birth, hopefully maybe, the last 4 digits of your Social Security number. But some states have it and some states don't. Some states produced it, some states didn't. So you're going to have really this incredible database of missing data points that are key and essential to determining whether or not there really are the same 2 people registered in 2 different states and voting. Because as we know, as I recall, I think it was either Jared Kushner who was registered to vote in 2 states. It's all ironic. It's just exactly. I name one of the more one within the family, right? So this notion that we're going to find, voter fraud through really, really bad methodology that only shows us bad data on voter registration is certainly not going to show us good data on voter fraud. The other interesting thing is on Crosscheck, for example, I think in the last few years that it's been around, they have found like over 7 million duplicate voter registrations across the states. Not a single indictment or prosecution of voter fraud. So that shows you the high propensity for error, number one. And like I said, secondly, it has a very, very disproportionate impact on communities of color. And so, like I said, the ACLU, of course, we get how Secretary Williams had to respond to this request and provide what is acceptable and required under our open records laws. We just hope that, that he would have taken a broad step forward and said, let's figure out how to enlarge the franchise instead of, intimidating folks. The notion that 5,000 people have, unregistered, we hope they register again real soon, because that's what we really, the best way to fight against this commission is to vote, register more people to vote, and make sure they do it. Let's work on making this franchise available to everyone, and let's not let this commission get away with what we think it's out to do. So thank you.
We'd be happy to take questions. In the back, you had your hand up first. So,
has the commission requested the list of voters in Colorado who have deregistered in the past few weeks?
I do not.
They have not.
Believe that
We're not aware of one anyway. Oh, Amber.
So
she will know.
the original. So the question was, did the commission ask for the people that have withdrawn or other statuses? The original request did request canceled records. So when you withdraw, you become a canceled voter. So I don't know, though, I have not received confirmation if the state only sent active and inactive, meaning registered voters, or if they sent the complete database. I don't know. The original request did request canceled voters.
How would we find that out?
I can send a text message in a few minutes and find out. I just don't know what they sent. We didn't receive confirmation. Alton, Joe, we haven't seen that, right? No? Okay. Okay.
The letter that Secretary Williams sent said that information, it says information of this kind exists only in canceled voter records, referring to other information regarding voter registration in another state. He said information of this kind exists only in canceled voter records, which we are not able to provide without extensive redaction of confidential voter data. That leads me to think that they did not send canceled records, but we don't know that for certain. That's my assumption based on what he said in his letter. So we can confirm that for you. Okay. Yes. You in the purple shirt. That's you.
Yes. Okay. You mentioned that your company, ACLU, was hoping that the mission of the commission is not to cut off voting in order to vote. What can the ACLU do about it if, in fact, that starts to happen? Or anybody else?
I think it was the day after the election, the ACLU submitted an open letter to Donald Trump, the subject line of which read, "We'll see you in court." And basically, Basically, we said if you intend to make good on the promises you made on the campaign, we'll sue you. So we're watching carefully. We actually have sued over this Integrity Commission as it is, as has Common Cause it has as well. And so I think any attempt to create kind of federal law around voting rights and those sorts of things we'll be watching very carefully. I think Amber's comment that voting and elections is a state issue will certainly be something that all of us will be talking about, and I'm sure Common Cause will be on the front lines as well.
I'm assuming that the lawsuit that was filed in Washington, D.C. had a request of injunctive relief, and it failed. Do you have any more details on that?
Is this?
That's the Common Cause one that I think she's talking about.
Oh, you're talking about the Common Cause one or the Epic one?
Oh, yeah, there's the epic one.
I don't know.
Well, there are several lawsuits.
What's the one that got publicity?
Yeah, I think it was Epic. Don't you think that was Epic? Yeah. And they did ask for some relief, and I don't know very many of the details. What I know is part of it turned on purely a legal question about whether this commission was considered a governmental entity. And when the court decided that it was not, then the ability to issue injunctive relief against the collection of the data was denied. But that doesn't mean they won't continue to litigate the issue of are they a governmental entity. So there was an initial finding about that. It's the ACLU has a lawsuit, Common Cause has a lawsuit, several other organizations have lawsuits, and some of them, the Common Cause one is a privacy-based lawsuit that challenges whether, based on the Federal Privacy Act, whether this commission should be entitled to collect data on individual citizens. It grew out of, the law itself grew out of the Watergate issue, where it became clear that there were people collecting information about all of us in the Watergate era. So that we also didn't get injunctive relief the other day, but the lawsuit's not dead. It just will need to proceed to the next stage to see if there's a way to make that happen. Carl.
I've heard that even if the information provided was public and already been given to many, many, many other people, their fear was what they would do with the information. They don't know what they could do with. Is there anything they could do with the information that's particularly threatening or harmful or dangerous?
They being the commission?
Yeah.
Well, we don't know exactly what they're going to do with it. It's going to get into a database, and we hope it's going to be secured at the White House. Yeah, well, maybe they could talk to Target or somebody, or Fox Studios or whatever it was to secure our data. I don't know what they're going to do, Carl. I mean, that's part of the concern, right, is that we don't know what's going to happen to it. And they'll manipulate it, they'll save it, they'll use it in ways we don't totally understand or know right now. So, yes, in the back.
And that's the reason why a lot of people are unregistered. Because even though a lot of it's secure, we don't know. You don't know. Nobody knows what they're going to do with that information. They got my name, they got my address, and they know that I vote, and now how that's going to be used, Lord, for all I know, the Chinese got it by now, And so that's why a lot of people are getting off of this. If you can give away my name and number and all of that, then you don't need to have it.
Yeah, and just from our office, I mean, I've spoken to voters personally. We got a letter the other day from a couple who have been election judges for us for 25 plus years, and they unregistered. And, what we are seeing is that, number one, people were not aware that their information was public, not just for this commission, but more overall. So I think there's sort of a lack of education a little bit about what is under Colorado law and what it's public and, who can do what. And every state varies, like Elizabeth said. Some states, there's limited access to just political campaigns and that use. And, you know, if you're going to use it for private enterprise or business or whatever, you can't get it, right? So there's that. And I think that that's a legislative decision. You know, that debate happened at the legislature, and our laws dictate these certain elements not being public. But I do think that this highlighted that people just weren't aware that so much was publicly available. And so we certainly have been getting questions about that for years prior to even the commission. And just I think in the era of so much being online and so much being available and data tracking and people being able to kind of monitor from above, it's created questions, and rightfully so. And and what I've said is, you know, I think it would be really helpful for the commission to articulate what they plan to do so that at least people can know. Because I get asked, and I'm an election official, and I haven't been, you know, we've received no communications about what is happening with the work of the commission. And I come at this from, I'm independent, I've been unaffiliated, I don't have a lens in terms of party when it comes to administering the voting process. And I think that that's an important piece of what election administrators do, is to keep partisanship out of the voting process, because it should be about fairness and accessibility and transparency. And so whenever it isn't, people get concerned. And, you know, I think the commission really should articulate what they plan to do so that people can understand, absorb that, and then respond to that. And that just hasn't happened. And so I think the unknown is really why there's been a lot of concern, and rightfully so.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, apart from the fact that we already know the White House cannot be trusted with confidential information because they released all the confidential information of people who objected to this already to the media. The real concern with our elections is voter suppression. And this commission has no intention, apparently, of even looking at that question. And that's the other thing that we have to fight against. I mean, Colorado, I'm not worried about. We have so many voter registration. We have a wide list of IDs that are acceptable in terms of, so the possibility of a person not being able to prove that who they say they are is marginalized. But
Do you want to get on this panel?
no.
That's a very good point.
But there are states, as we know, that may have thrown this election because of voter suppression. What is the ACLU and Common Cause doing about voter suppression?
Well, we're doing a lot all over the country, and it varies state by state because different states have different laws. We've always fought, at least at the legislative arena, against any legislation that purports to bring election integrity by, you know, requiring IDs or making it more complicated. There is a bill or two or three or 10 in Colorado at every legislative session that tries to do something to your access to the voting booth, whether it's trying to take cuts at the Voting Modernization Act. Let's limit the early voting day period. Let's limit the number of polling places, polling centers. Let's require photo ID. So we're certainly, along with Common Cause and other groups, at the forefront of fighting against that kind of legislation. Legally, I mean, here in Colorado, we're fortunate. We do have, I think, one of the best voting acts in the country, and we're trying to serve as a model elsewhere. We sell that to our other ACLU affiliates so they can take it to their legislatures so that it can become a model nationwide, and I'm sure that Common Cause does the same thing. And, you know, like Elizabeth made in her opening remarks, we sued Kobach in Kansas, when Secretary of State, in 2005 for some of his taking people off the voter rolls. So we're constantly vigilant about things like that. The access to the, your right to vote is a fundamental tenet of our democracy, and we'll fight for it any way, anywhere, and every way we can.
And let me just say one more thing, because you're right that, the Colorado model and what we've done here certainly is about access. It's about kind of all those values I talked about. And I spoke to an election official that called last week, and Alton has spoke to the same election official, and Alton's from my office. She called for, and she's from a Midwestern state that I won't, I guess, call out. But she called, and, she's trying to advocate for simply, they have an absentee ballot request process, and you have to have an excuse to get an absentee ballot. It has to be one of, 8 to 10 reasons, including, a health issue or a work emergency and all these things, right? And she's just trying to get that expanded so that more people can just request an absentee ballot. And I asked her a few questions on the phone, and she ended up telling me that in their jurisdiction, which is a very large city in the Midwest, they had their average wait time on election day across all their entire state was 3 hours. And sort of in addition to that process, they also have, precinct residency requirements that I mentioned that we got rid of in Colorado. And so there's rules and there's regulations that make it difficult. And I know there's no way everybody waited that long. And that is, and then they don't have options for early voting, and they can't get an absentee ballot. It's like one barrier after another that, and it shouldn't be that way, because at the end of the day, these are customers. They have a right to do something. And Pew did a really good study about, they surveyed Americans about what Americans viewed as the most important of all their rights, what are the most important in terms of essential to their freedoms. And the freedom of speech was number 1, the right to vote was number 2, and the right to privacy was number 3. So it doesn't at all surprise me that people would be concerned, given that they're of those top 3 things, 2 of those are privacy and the right to vote, and that's what kind of is the crux of this entire discussion. So rules and regulations and what's happening in each state certainly dictates people's access, and that's really where, I think we've done a really good job in Colorado. We've been sharing that with other places, but it is that data-driven approach and looking at what are customers requesting and what are they asking for and what are their challenges and what are their barriers, and responding to that in a cohesive way that isn't partisan. That's not a partisan issue. That's just a customer service issue, right? So that's how I would.
We have about 5 minutes left, so just
Okay.
put that out there.
I wonder if any of you have watched Greg Palast's film. I think it's called Billionaires and Ballot Bandits. He's an investigative reporter who is, it's about a 2-hour, I think, video now, reporting on cross-checks. And 3 years ago, he showed how cross-check was used in key swing states, including Colorado, and probably swung the election to Gardner over Udall. His figures were about 300,000 names were put on a list who supposedly voted in 2 states on the same day. They were sent a letter saying, we suspect you may have voted in 2 places, 2 states in the same day. Please respond. And if they didn't respond, they would be, in effect, taken off the voting rolls, and most given a provisional ballot.
That doesn't sound right to me off the top of my head without watching the video.
That's not something that happened in Colorado.
Yeah,
but I don't know about other states, but that's certainly not something that would happen here.
You're saying that in 2014, Secretary of State, was it Williams or was it Gessler?
It was Gessler at that time.
Are you saying he never sent letters out within Colorado?
No, he sent letters. He did send letters out, but they didn't result in 300,000 people being taken off the voting
He didn't
list.
say that. He said there were.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood that.
250,000, but there were about that many people that were
That was nationwide.
on the list. The number of people that were actually probably not able to vote was much smaller than that, but enough. I think it was over 50,000 or something. It was in the range of the difference between Udall's and Gardner's vote.
So maybe one of you talk about the protections of the MVRA, that might be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, and I can speak to that. So under the National Voter Registration Act, there are various protections, like states can't just withdraw without minimum matching criteria, and there's a process. So, in Colorado now, it's basically that process doesn't start for you unless we get something back undeliverable from your address. If we send you a confirmation card and that comes back and you miss subsequent elections, that would potentially then you'd become a canceled registered voter for the undeliverable mail plus missing and not interacting with the election office over a long period of time. So it wouldn't be the case that if we just got a match or like cross-check identified someone, which cross-check has been utilized here, but if that got sent to us, we don't withdraw from that because that doesn't comply with our laws, and it also doesn't comply under the National Voter Registration Act. So I'm not familiar at all.
The secretary's
I'm not.
colleagues that went to the guest witness.
Well, so the Secretary of State in Colorado doesn't run the election, first off. So each county runs the actual election, and that's a nuance that a lot of people don't understand. And like sometimes when you hear the Secretaries of State talk, you would think they run elections, but actually,
battle going
but actually the conduct of the election and the eligibility determinations and the vote tallying and the issuance of ballots, all that process, that happens at the local, each jurisdiction, and that's bipartisan election judges that are involved in that and all of that. So it's actually run locally, even more so than when we say state as local. It's actually more local. Elections are very much a local process, embedded in the community, and we have election judges that oversee these various elements. So if you have information about that particular report or that study, I'm certainly happy to review it and look at it, but I can confirm for you that that's not something that we saw in Denver or statewide that I'm aware of. So,
One more question, and then we're gonna have to leave it at that.
Yes.
Well, I just wanted to find out, is it across the state, is the Secretary of State into every county like they are into the Denver city and county? Because I know how you comply here, I've worked with you on that, but I don't know about the rest of the state. And do all the clerks and recorders have the same integrity as Ms. Johnson does and as the ones we had earlier before you came? Because they've worked hard at trying to get every vote to count. I know that.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
my question is it really uniform statewide what the Secretary of State requires of each clerk and recorder?
Yes, I would say, and Amber, oh, I'm sorry. The question was, are the standards that are used to measure accountability and compliance uniform across the state, so that every clerk and recorder in every county has to do the same, hold to the same standards? I'll let Amber speak to this, but from my experience, and part of what I do as the elections director at Common Cause is go visit clerks and recorders around the state. So before the 2016 election, I think I went and visited, of the 64, I went and visited maybe 25 of them and sat down and chatted with them and talked to them and reviewed their plans and tried to determine what they were going to do. I would say to a person, every single clerk and recorder tries very hard, to the very best of their ability, to comply and to run their election in accordance with the Colorado law. I think the Secretary of State has good oversight and monitoring of how the elections are being run. I think they are all, in my experience, very well intentioned. Every state is different. Every state.